All right. Oh, I forgot to do the
All
countdown.
right.
Oh, dang it.
Oh,
All
no
right,
worries.
but
It's fine.
I,
It's all right. We
We
don't
can
need
count
any.
it down, right?
yeah. No, it'd be a little awkward if I just start the countdown
3.
now. Yeah. So what's up? Welcome back to the stream, everybody. This will be a fun episode. We're back here with Edoardo and our good buddy, Dr. Jim Madden. So Jim, Edoardo and I do this like joint stream on both of our channels. And we had started this series, which you might be interested in joining us for another segment at some point, called Science or Sophistry. And we just take, some topic and we try to analyze it as best as we can. Turns out most of it has been sophistry at this point. We've yet to
Turns
encounter
out
any.
most of it has been COVID so far, but
Yeah, no, I listened to your COVID episode and I thought it was
all right.
fabulous.
Thank you, appreciate it. So,
Nice.
but anyway, so Edoardo and I have talked about many things behind the scenes, and we talked a little bit about philosophy of mind not too long ago. And I know, Edoardo, you just read Phaser's book not too long ago. You liked it. And I mentioned, hey, I got a buddy. He's got books on this, and I've been wanting to do, and we've talked about doing an introduction to philosophy of mind episode anyway. So I'm like, let's get the gang together and see what happens.
Right.
So I have no agenda for this, Jim. I figured I'd kind of let you lead the conversation, and we can just see how it develops. And if anybody has any questions or they want to engage in the chat, then we can play along with that as well. I don't know, Edoardo, do you have any kind of initial thoughts or?
No, I wasn't prepared for this, but
Yeah. So I find this interesting. So you've just read Phaser's book, which is a general introduction to philosophy of mind, but it's also it's I mean, like Phaser would say, it's an opinionated introduction, right? He's coming at it from like with a mind to defend a kind of non-materialism, right? So I'd be interested just off the bat, Edoardo, how, like, you as a physicist, right? How do you do with that kind of non-materialist approach, right? Is that something you could find you can accommodate? Is that something you find, scientifically unacceptable? Do you see where I'm going there?
yeah. So let me stress this thing. It's something I already commented a couple of times when talking about COVID. So I mean, the idea about science is it's first of all, you should talk about evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And so everything you say should be evidence-based. And then whatever theory you make out of that, so whatever reality is, that's reality, right? And so I don't have prejudice in so far as whatever you call mind, or, whatever, it can be dualism, or you might say there's some kind of separated substance from matter. Mm-hmm. Insofar that you have like some proofs of that, there's some, like some hard evidence for the fact that things cannot be reduced to simple matter.
Right.
Like, I mean, for myself, like, of course, like as a physicist, I would say it's hard. I mean, at least I wouldn't. That's not the first thought I would have on the issue. Like, I would be, of course, sort of try to be a reductionist on the issue, but that doesn't need to be, right? Because nature. I mean, we didn't make nature. We don't know what the laws of nature are, and in principle, it can be anything. Like that's my take on everything. So there's a lot of stuff we don't know out there, and even though, I mean, I might argue that materialism works like pretty well in physics, work really, really well, and maybe in other sciences such as biology. That doesn't mean it has to be, right? So that's an approach that worked in the past in some fields, and so in general, I know that you can learn. You learn more if you don't have prejudice, right?
Right.
If you don't have any outlook that's preventing some views on the world to take place.
Yeah. Yeah, let me just say how much I appreciate that attitude, right? Is that the scientists, in true fashion, should be looking more at the world and their data, not necessarily their current paradigm, right? And it's the world and the data that should be informing the paradigm, not these a priori, or preconceived commitments that force or constrain what you will even allow as data to begin with. So that's cool. I mean, I just have nothing but agreement with that right off the bat, Jim.
And Edoardo, when you say and I think obviously correct, right? That you would demand evidence for any inference we make, right? Right. Are you, when you think of evidence, are you thinking of it entirely in terms of repeatable experimentation, right? So or do you see it when you say evidence? Do you mean something broader? Like, would you count a thought experiment, right, as a piece of evidence, right?
So thought experiments are fine, and I think that, I mean, that's how physics evolved in a way. If you remember, if you know the history of general relativity, that's how general relativity took place. Basically, that's
Right.
it started out of thought experiments from Einstein. So I think that's something you cannot. It's not exactly like a piece of evidence from the world, because again, things work both ways. So something I can think of, or I can make a thought experiment, it doesn't mean it's telling me something relevant about the nature of nature. So
Right.
in principle, again, but you can make some thought experiment that show that there is some contradiction within some worldview, and that's an interesting insight. So again, it's acceptable insofar it brings something to the to discourse. Like if you learn something by doing this sort of experiment, and or at least you can show that there's some flow in the logic, or there's some flow in some worldview. So in that sense, I would say, yeah, I wouldn't accept it as a piece of evidence, just like hard evidence from the worldview. From the world. Like you do an experiment, and that's you measure this, and that's it.
The world pushed back in a way we couldn't.
Yeah,
exist.
exactly.
Yeah.
But of course, it's a way that science proceeds, right? So you have to think about scenarios and see, all right, so how much is this hypothetical scenario telling me about the world? So can I, does this imply something about the actual world? Does this imply something about actual reality? Like in principle, I do not know. It sort of depends on the actual thought experiment. But yeah, they're useful.
Okay, and I'm just kind of probing because I want to advance some theses, but I want to make sure I do it in a way that we can communicate, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
And so when you say you see, I mean, and maybe I'm like materialism as a default, right? Or it works really well in science, right?
Yeah.
And so I agree with you. And that should kind of make it a default, right? It's sort of, the burden of proof is shifted in favor of it, right? What do you mean by materialism then?
Let's say things that can be explained in physical terms, like a series of phenomena that I can explain, or I can try to reduce to purely physical laws in a way. And so maybe equations for basic principles of physics.
Okay.
So it has to be susceptible to a sort of quantification. Would you say that's a criteria?
I would say so, yeah, probably.
Right.
Again, I mean, these are things I didn't think about the whole thing through, so that's
this is just a free form discussion.
That's my gut feeling about it. Let's put it this way.
And one distinction I want to make earlier, and I think Edoardo was hinting at this, right, is that, and I'm with you, like this default assumption in a methodological naturalism, right? Like I think that like science, like that should be the default assumption, like that's the method. But is there good reason to take the method and turn it into a metaphysics? I think that's eventually a question we're going to have to come up with, right? But we can bracket that off. Yeah.
So, okay, so a couple of things. So first, I think a really important question anytime these kind of conversations are had is to straighten out what I think is the operative ambiguity in almost all of these kinds of conversations, right? And I see this come up even in serious philosophical, even cognitive science literature, and then even in popular conversations, is this ambiguity where we'll say things like mind or consciousness or thought or what have you is based on physical occurrences in the organism, right? Or it's grounded in physical occurrences in the organism, or it's caused by physical occurrences in the organism, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And that's ambiguous because something could be grounded in, could be, founded upon, could be caused by, but not be exactly the same thing, right?
Yep.
And so I always want to make clear when we're talking about materialism, do we mean that there's a causal explanation for mental phenomena in physical processes, or do we mean mental processes just are physical processes, right? They're exactly the same thing. Okay. I think one of those theses is almost undeniable. Okay. And I think one of them is obviously false, right? So I think that there is a causal antecedent for mental phenomena in physical processes is almost undeniable, right? That they are the exact same thing, I think is to the same degree obviously false. Right? Do you see that? Right.
Yep.
And so maybe let me try to motivate the latter, right? And see what you think of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
Sure. Okay. And so this is kind of a tired thought experiment that I've used on Pat's show before, right? But let's suppose you have a person, right? His name is Cormac, and he's currently, having a thought or making a judgment about Paris, right? Okay, so he's thinking, Paris is the capital of the French Republic, right? Okay. Certainly there is a physical process going on in Cormac as he's doing that, right? And I'm perfectly happy to say, even if not yet, at some point that physical process will be predictively sufficient for us to know what Cormac is thinking about. Meaning, we will know enough about the nervous system to say, under normal conditions, under someone with a normal nervous system that hasn't been damaged, et cetera, that if Cormac is in this physical state, we could pretty certainly say he's thinking about Paris. Okay, I think that's what, even though we're not there yet, I think that's within the realm of possibility. Okay, so I'm granting that it's predictively sufficient under normal conditions that you could go from the physical process within the organism to, and even within the nervous system within the organism, to what the thought is. Okay. Does that mean that the thought is the very same thing as that physical process? Okay, that's what I want to deny. Okay. And my reason for that is I think we can imagine, okay, now this is where we're about the thought experiment thing, right? Scenarios where it would seem very implausible to think that thought that physical process was occurring, and yet it was still grounding a thought about Paris. Okay. So let's suppose you had a neuroscientist, clone a brain, right? We're doing science fiction here, right? Clones a brain, just like Cormac's, so it's cloned from his stem cells, and grows it, and then somehow directly stimulates that brain to have the underlying physical process go on in that brain that would have been going on in Cormac when he's thinking about Paris. Okay. I think it's absurd to say that that's a thought about Paris. Okay. Because there's no relation between that neurophysiological state and the actual city. Okay. There's no connection between the two. All right. It'd be like saying you could have a caveman, right, before the existence of the city of Paris, by some fluke have that particular neural pathway become active, right? And then that would thereby be a thought about Paris, even though there was no such thing as Paris. Okay. And so my point is that the content of the thought, right, the semantics of the thought are always derivative from the nervous system and really the rest of the organism, and a relationship to something in the world that grounds it. Okay. So I see thought as something that is relational between processes in organisms and entities in the world. Okay. And if you take out the entities in the world, right, or that the organism doesn't have the right relationship to those entities in the world and never has had it, I find it hard to believe that you can say that the thought with the content is occurring. Okay. And that tells me then we can't just identify the thought with the occurrence in the nervous system. Okay. Does that make sense? And I'd like to hear what you think about that sort of thing.
So I'm pretty happy with your line of reasoning in the sense that it makes sense, of course.
Hold on, Edoardo. You're Jim, is that coming through for you?
Yeah,
Eduardo's breaking up on my end.
I've lost him.
Yeah, sorry, Edoardo. Let's give it a minute. You're kind of breaking up, lagging here, not really coming through.
We're going international here. This is
yeah, we're streaming Edoardo in from Italy.
We're not in Kansas anymore.
No. Daniela says, "Wow, never thought about something like this." Jim, your thought experiment.
You're gonna like the new book, Daniela.
Yeah, I mean these thought experiments are really fun. We'll just chat while Edoardo reconnects here. And just to kind of like point about thought experiments is certainly, you know, some of them I think can and should count as evidence. Certainly if you can draw out a contradiction, right? Like, can I know a priori that there are or are not aliens out there? No, certainly not. That's something I need to investigate. Can I know a priori that there are no colorless green aliens out there? Absolutely, right? Because that's just a straightforward contradiction, right? So I don't need to go undertake any type of empirical investigation to know that, right? There's other degrees of thought experiments which I sometimes go back and forth on, in the sense that they seem to entail absurdity, but not a strict contradiction. Yeah. So it makes things less.
That's what I'm doing. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes things less plausible for me, in a sense, even if I can't completely put it off the table.
It's a burden-proof shifter.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. Eduardo's back.
Yeah. So I'm sort of I was trying to fix my connection because it's so bad. But anyway,
it sounds good now. So yeah.
Yes. Oh, great. So
just start over and repeat everything you said.
Yeah. No. So it's. I mean, I think it's a pretty strong argument. What you say, that thought itself, of course, cannot be reduced. I mean, if you see it like this, cannot be reduced to the thought of Paris. I'm just wondering if you could make this a thing of complexity in a way, in a sense that I'm not aware of the way that the brain works, right? So, but I'm thinking about AI, for example. This is I know this. I mean, I read the book by Fraser, and I think he had a pretty strong argument about against the reductionist argument when you try to model the mind as a computer. But I'm thinking about AI. Like, in principle, you have you can train the AI to recognize images. So you got these systems that they get trained, and then they recognize images, and they tell you, look, this is a cat, this is Paris, or whatever. And the system is the same, right? You got the neural network that you program, and so until you don't feed the neural network with images of Paris, it will never be able to recognize Paris in this way.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that it doesn't have the chance to do that. It's like that's like the network there is just not used to that kind of concept. But still, I mean, in this case, you cannot deny that there's at least a possibility to, of course, to generate the idea of Paris.
Right.
And that there is more than the AI itself, than the algorithm itself in this case, right?
Yeah, I would think a similar thing about the human nervous system. So, I mean, the human nervous system did not.
Okay,
now Jim's chopping up.
Now Jim's
thank you, gentle listeners, for your patience. We'll get Jim back here in a minute. This is fun though. This is good stuff. Yeah.
It's good stuff. But anyway, no. So, like in my opinion, so my first thought.
There he is. Okay, he's back. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So like, as I was saying, it's like the human nervous system didn't evolve to think about Paris, right? It evolved sort of general dispositions for certain types of cognitive powers, and they can be realized according to different relations that it can have to different entities in the world, right? Okay, and so like going where you went, Edoardo, yeah. So you had you were organisms that are with the capacity to have certain thoughts, okay, in the same way that the computer might be. It has the capacity of certain types of thoughts, but those capacities won't be particularized until you feed a certain image into it, or you put it into a certain relationship. Okay, so I'm fine with that. And my point is only though that the process internal to the machine or internal to the organism is not alone sufficient for there to be a thought. Okay, it has to be that process in relationship to something external to it in order for the thought to be constituted. Okay, so my position is that thoughts are not things that happen discretely internal to organisms. It's always something that happens, or machines, if machines have them, right? They always happen in a sort of supervenience on a relationship between some cognitive entity and a world that it's embedded in, right? I find that significant because then I think that makes trouble for reductivist theses, right? So if we take reduction to mean that you can, you have a certain theory with a limited scope of explanation, and we can dissolve it into a theory that has a broader scope of explanation. Okay, this would then mean we can't dissolve thought into the theory of neurology, right, or neuroscience, because neuroscience is not the complete story of what constitutes a thought. It's the neurophysiology in a relationship to the rest of the organism that's in a relationship to an entire world it's embedded in. Okay, so for me, this doesn't necessarily identify thought as some other particular entity distinct from the organism, but it shows thought is not something that can be given an explanation in terms of any discrete component among the things that constitute it, including what goes on inside the organism. Mm-hmm. So what I think is significant here is it opens up an explanatory latitude for our self-understanding that is not tied to anything that we can see as discretely reducible to a particular scientific theory.
Right on. Yeah. No.
Right. No. It's it's complicated. And so,
it's complicated. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. So maybe we could break this out a little bit, right? Because there's different ways that kind of people argue about this, and there's different aspects or properties of our conscious experience where they argue from, right? So whether it's rationality, that's Phaser's track. Like he focused on rationality specifically, but other philosophers focus on qualia. Right. Yeah. Which is very important because they say whatever machines are doing, they're not really thinking because there's this sort of, they call it the qualitative abyss, right? Like the what it is likeness, or at least like we would never be able to know that they have that sort of qualitative experience, right? Because presumably they're being arranged from these components that are that don't have consciousness, don't have intentionality, that aren't directed at anything. And then somehow we have to imagine just by stacking these things together, we get this qualitative shift, right? Not just a quantitative measure of new complexity, but we actually somehow get a qualitative shift. And the general argument there is that it's kind of like assuming you could get a purple tower out of just white Lego blocks, right? Like it doesn't matter how many white Lego blocks you have. It doesn't matter how complex you make the structure. Yeah. We just don't have the qualitative categories on hand to affect that kind of traversal, right? I'm just giving a rough sketch here. Yeah. Then, there's phasers, which he's kind of borrowing from James Ross, which to me is one of the most powerful because he's showing that they're actually, he's giving a deductive proof, right? Where he shows that all formal thinking is determinate, right? In its conceptual content, but no purely physical process is ever determinate, right? So whatever else formal thinking is, it's not going to reduce. Now you have to support those premises. And how does Phaser do the first one? The first one he supports by showing to even try and deny that formal thinking is determinate, like you have to presuppose it, right? Because you have to have a determinate conception of what you're denying. So you're always going to have this self-defeat problem if you try to get off of the first premise. And then the second one's pretty easy, right? Like any physical thing is going to have sort of almost an infinite number of ways that we can represent it, think about it, right, over and above the physical facts, right? So that's a more technical argument, but I think when you dive into the weeds of that, it's very interesting. But that's kind of focusing on intentionality and rationality. And then you have these broad class of the thought experiments that Jim's talking about. You gave one. There's other ones like classic, just identity types of thought experiments, which yours is it may be a class of. I don't know if you consider it that, but I'll just throw this one out there. We can jam on it. Me and Jim have jammed before, right? Is that take Leibniz's law, right? Just the law of identity, right? If A equals B, then whatever is true of A has to be true of B and vice versa. And whatever properties are true of A will be true of B, right? That's just hard to deny the law of identity, right? At least if you're going to have, any meaningful discourse afterwards. If I want to say that whatever a thought is, it just is some physical process, like whatever's going in my nervous system or brain, or you could say whatever it is. We seem to have a tension with the law of identity here, in as much as I'm directly aware of my thought, say my thought of Edoardo or thought of a zebra. I'm directly aware of it, right? But I have no awareness of any axons firing in my brain whatsoever, right? But if A is equal to B, then whatever is true of A should also be true of B, right? And vice versa. So think of like the heads of the coin and the tails of the coin. Like if I'm directly aware, if I think the heads of the coin is the tails of the coin, and I'm directly aware of one but not the other, there's a problem here, right? And clearly the heads of the coin isn't the same as the tails of the coin. They might be, and here's the important point, they might be part of the one and the same thing. And I think our thoughts and our physicality are part of one and the same reality as well, namely us, right? I think they are part of the same reality, but they're still really distinct. And so those identity type of arguments are, I think, good motivation, right? I don't know if you can get an explicit contradiction out of them. But as you said, Jim, I think, Edoardo, when you kind of like logged off, we were talking about the usefulness of thought experiments. And I said they kind of come in various gradations for me, right? If we can get a contradiction out of it, then it's a done deal for me, right? Like I don't need any empirical confirmation. Like I can know that there's no colorless green aliens in space, because the idea of a colorless green alien is just a contradiction. That can't exist anywhere, right? I don't need to go out and investigate that. That's a done deal, right? I can know that a priori. Other thought experiments just give you really absurd situations, but not contradictions. And to me, that at least shifts the burden of proof, right? It makes something less plausible for me, even if I can't completely put it off the table. And a lot of these kind of class of identity arguments are kind of like that to me. Like they really lessen the plausibility of a strict sort of reductionist, physicalist approach to mine. Sorry, I just threw a lot on the table out there, so you guys can take it however you want.
A couple of things, I think, with all those, whether we're doing quality arguments, and I want to say some specific things about quality arguments, why I'm not such a big fan of them anymore. But whether we're talking about quality arguments,
wait. I think it's useful for the listeners to have a brief introduction to what qualia are, because it's probably not something which is.
Sure. Yes, apologies. We did call this an introduction episode, and we're throwing out these technical terms. So
let me go right to the quality argument thing, right? So supposedly, and note the supposedly, what qualia are the pure qualitative aspects. I know that's circular, right? But the pure qualitative aspects of experience, right? It's, using, the Thomas Nagel's language on this, the what it feels like, right? What it seems like, okay? What it seems like to taste chocolate, what it seems like, what it feels like to see red, okay?
The what it is likeness.
The what it is likeness, okay? And my favorite example, it's like one of the lesser known ones from Nagel, right? Is he says when if I take a bite of chocolate, so what it's like to taste chocolate, okay? That you can't identify with any discrete process in my brain, because he says if you licked any part of my brain, it wouldn't taste like chocolate. But yet there's a fact of the matter of not a fact. There's a subjective state of what it's like to taste chocolate. Okay. So the idea is then this shows that there's a kind of mental content that we have that can't be identified with anything going on in us physiologically, even if it's caused by, grounded in, based on something going on physiologically. Okay. Now, I guess I worry about that, because I just think phenomenologically, I think it misses how experience works. Okay, so because it assumes that one, like our access to qualia is entirely looking into ourselves. It's introspective. Okay, and it assumes that our experience comes to us in these kinds of cognitive, emotive, qualitative atoms that we can separate out from the context that they come to us in. Okay. And I think if you really look at a lot of the very rigorous work being done by neurophenomenologists like Evan Thompson, I think they're making a very good case that that's just not really how we operate, right? That you like, if you ask me, what is the color? What's it like to experience the color scarlet, right? For me, because of having read The Scarlet Letter in high school, right, that there's a certain emotional, moral connotation to the color scarlet, right, that I can't separate out from the actual visual experience of scarlet anymore. Okay. And so for me to experience scarlet, right, is already to embed myself in this whole world of meanings. Okay. This whole cultural tradition, right? Or, if you ask me, like, what is the pure experience of tasting chocolate? It's not something I have an access to just by pure introspection. I can't separate it from memories I have of Christmas, right? Or things like that. Okay. And so my point is that these so-called qualitative aspects of consciousness are not really articulable independently from this whole network of meanings and commitments that they're embedded in, right? Which I think is significant, because once again, it's showing our mindedness is not something that goes on discreetly between our ears in this sort of atomistic way. It's always drawing us out to involve us in something further, right? Which, I think is plenty reason to doubt like reductive materialism, right? Okay, but for different reasons.
So yeah, what do I guess, and I want Edoardo to chime in here too, but how do I feel about the qualia arguments? I don't know. I guess it's not the first thing I advance if I'm trying to prove a point, but I have to say it is like when I first encountered those, like it did move me in a certain way, right? Like if we define the world a certain way, or we postulate the world as a certain way, that at reality, like nothing else is really there but shapes and motions, to crudely, right? That like whatever else this world is comprised of, it's things that are, again, fundamentally devoid of consciousness, teleology, intentionality, all these categories, right?
Yeah.
And then we do have to imagine that somehow, with enough of those things and enough time and enough features of arrangement, they did have this sort of qualitative like flip, right? That they just transformed into essentially everything that is the qualitative opposite, and disparateness too. That's another one of those things.
But it's assuming there's such a thing as like pure qualitativeness, and that's what I'm saying.
That's what you're trying to reject.
Yeah, or at least to say I think it's an artificial way of approaching how we actually engage with the world cognitively, right? And that even something like the taste of chocolate only comes online because I have attachments and commitments, right, prior to the experience, right? And I think this becomes not a problem for AI, but I think it becomes a way of showing of whatever we can do with machines, it's not what we humans are doing, right? Because for we humans, our experience, our cognition is always grounded in these kinds of care and concernful attachments, right? These animal, right, cultural attachments that we have is what structures our experience, right? Even if we could say that there are machines that match us cognitively, does that make sense?
Sorry, I have to keep muting my microphone because I'm talking like crazy. So, Edoardo, you do some talking.
No. I just because all the time, the thing I'm thinking all the time is whether it's some kind of Turing test, right? Some kind of way that you could really tell, okay, a machine couldn't be able to tell you something like this. Now, when I talk about qualia, of course, it's like some kind of subjective experience that everyone has, but we all converge to some degree when we talk about properties of things. So it's like subjective, but you can attach, as you said, you can attach some kind of feelings or thoughts or memories to some color. But then in the end, we all agree that this color, unless you have some kind of disease or whatever, then we all agree. Like there's many properties we all converge on, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but anyway, like thinking about AI, whenever we talk about this, these points, which are very, there are pretty strong points that disfavor materialism, because I don't really have an answer to that. And I mean, probably, I don't know why, but whatever. It's like I cannot really. It's true that you cannot really explain qualia in purely materialistic terms. However, I always think, okay, what is there a way that a machine, if I can train a machine or a robot somehow, and I wouldn't be able to tell like some kind of extended Turing test, like say I'm asking about the color scarlet to some machine, and then the answer would be completely indistinguishable from whatever you would say. Like I know that you and me, we have some kind of experience, and it's not even easy to tell you what this experience is, right?
Yeah.
But from the outside, like, can we make? I mean, is it thinkable, like, to make a world of robots where all of them have both like a shared experience of colors and properties of qualia, so in general, but also have this kind of subjective sphere of thoughts and experiences that attach to this color, which is characterizing it.
Let me bracket whether or not the machine could have subjective experience, and maybe we'll circle back to that. And I'll say, whatever it has, it won't be our subjective experience, okay? Because our subjective experience is framed by a very particular, very contingent cultural and biological history, right? And for each of us, it's also framed by a very particular personal history of attachment, right? We know that human cognition only comes online, right, when embedded in certain kinds of emotional attachments to other human beings, right? You have to learn language, right, through human attachment, right? Or at least that's how it normally happens, okay? And so my thesis is that inherent to cognition is the history through which cognition comes to be, okay? And whatever capacities we could develop machines to have, they would not come to be through the human history, okay? And so I would then say that there is something in principle different between whatever is going on with machines and whatever is going on among humans when we cognize, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, but I beg to differ on a small issue here, because you can have, if you have reinforcement learning, so if you have this kind of systems with machines that learn, they sort of evolve the database, like the way they learn, the way they classify things.
Yeah.
And so I can envision a system that you start with some kind of pre-trained neural network, and then with some kind of reinforcement learning. Of course, if the machine moves in some kind of environment, it develops the ability, for example, to recognize certain objects and make some kind of connections, even with the language. So with natural language processing, that also depends on the kind of languages that the machine, the kinds of text, and the kind of basically the kind of text that the machine is exposed to, and then the way it interprets the text. And then you can come up with very different machines just based on the fact that, just like we humans, right? Because what we do is we process what we see, what we hear, what we face, and then it becomes part of brain, and it changes our experience accordingly. But that's the same thing with machines in a way. I can think about again, with reinforcement learning applied to neural networks, I can think about these networks that learn continuously, and they get some feedback from the external environment, and then they change the connections inside, and then they update it, and so they sort of, you can develop different some kind of consciousnesses and the different ways of interacting. And also, I mean, you can envision machines that there's actually already here, like this very powerful GP3. I don't know if you heard about that, but there's this powerful algorithms, this powerful nonlinear, language models. Yes,
I'm happy to concede that. I mean, I think we have. I mean, I think there's a perfectly good sense in which we have machines that would pass limited Turing tests already, right? I mean, is that fair to say? I mean, you could think of like playing chess as a Turing test, right? I mean, and so I would leave it to the experts to tell me whether or not we'll have machines that will completely whip us in Turing tests across the board, or they could match us in Turing tests, right? I think we probably will. Okay. My point, though, is what binds us to the conceptuality, right, is first and foremost a kind of concern and care, an attachment to others from whom we've learned that conceptuality, right? That I don't think is present in the machine. And I'm not sure what it would be like for a machine to have concern, to have attachment, right? Because I think like something like existential concern, right, is a product of biology, or it's something inherent in living organisms, right, that you wouldn't have in machines. Okay, so I'm happy to say we might have machines that are going to outstrip us cognitively, right, or at least match us cognitively, like, and worrisomely they're going to outstrip us, right? But that doesn't mean that they're doing what we do when we think, right? Because what we do is wrapped up in this other thing: care, concern, attachment. You see my point? Yeah.
No, I see. I mean, because when you talk about care and concern, then it's something that is within you, and we both know what we are talking about.
Yeah.
So the point is that, of course, when you talk about the machine, it's something you cannot really envision. However, what about if you? I mean, again, this is just speculation, but
that's what we're here to do, right?
Some kind of exactly.
Yeah.
So some very complicated machine that, as a byproduct, has this kind of concerns. Like maybe you cannot say it has some concern, because then you should ask the machine, "Are you concerned?" They probably ask, they'll probably reply, "Yes, I am."
Right.
You cannot really say what's going there inside, like within the circuits, but then they would behave just like they do. So this is it's a functionalistic way of looking at things, which might not be completely correct, but it has its shortcomings, of course. But the same thing about you, right? So at some point I might cross my path with some machine that is completely undistinguishable from a human being, also from this point of view, because I can ask, everything I can do, I can ask you, and I know you're not a computer, and your sense of consciousness, your sense of caring about a human being, as far as I know, exactly, that's as far as I can tell. Yeah. So that's always something I can infer from the outside, but it's not unthinkable. Like from my point of view, now, one of the issues with for example, with machine learning and with natural language processing in the field of AI, is with irony and sarcasm. That's really, really, really hard to do. But it doesn't mean that they are there. There's this nice. I mean, it's. I don't know if it's a nice example, but there was this article about GPT-3, which is the latest. The most advanced natural language processing model. So it's like a very advanced AI. It's been developed by OpenAI, and it's basically it's a machine learning. It's an artificial intelligence engine that is able to answer questions and write articles. You just write an input, and then basically. I think the best story about this is that the article that was presenting this GPT-3 language model was written by GPT-3 itself. Right. And at some point, there's this famous article that went out a couple of weeks ago about a journalist that asked, "What's the question to the answer 42?" So I'm pretty sure this 42 thing, this meme from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's like it's the answer to everything and whatever. And the answer of the machine. So he was asking, "So what's the question to the answer 42?" And the machine answered just with the question mark.
Right.
Which is pretty. I mean, I found it like it's a nice joke. Wow. It was impressive. Anyway, it doesn't show. Yeah. I don't know what it shows, but it's just it's something that was unthinkable even 2 years ago.
Right.
Something to this level, and so again, this is a functionalist view, like that. It's mimicking what we do, right?
Yeah.
But to the degree that I cannot, again, making some kind of very advanced Turing test, to the degree I cannot tell if it's someone there behind or it's just a computer telling me that. I don't know, because then it's like me and you. I'm pretty sure you have feelings just like I do, but what do I know?
Right. Yeah. The problem of other minds. Yeah. Well, I just want to say just one quick thing about all of this, right? Is that I have not studied AI as in depth as probably either of you, right? But Spitzer actually has a really good article on consciousness and intentionality and Turing tests and all that. I don't have it fresh enough in my mind to speak intelligently on it, but maybe we can find it and link it in the show notes. However, for me, like, it's the background and sort of metaphysical considerations that bear more on the AI considerations, right? Because AI stuff in general, to my mind, I don't see it necessarily proving anything one way or another apart from the deeper metaphysical considerations, right? Because if I'm not a reductive materialist, then I don't necessarily have an issue of thinking that we could arrange things in such a way that maybe a robot could be conscious, right? You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
But if I am a hardball physicalist, then I do think we have this traversal problem, right? So that's where I think some of this AI stuff is it's a little too far down the road, if you see what I'm saying, right? It's the previous metaphysical considerations, right? And if you could make a robot conscious, I don't know how you would know that, right? Like what Ars saying, but like say like you could do that. That wouldn't make me a physicalist. You see what I'm saying? Like I'd be like,
say that you've got non-physical states supervening on
right. Exactly.
So.
Exactly. If anything, I would actually say that's better evidence against physicalism, right? Because I'm already like convinced by the evidence that if physicalism were true, like there wouldn't be consciousness on the scene at all.
No, I see them as entirely separate issues.
Yeah. So you see what I'm saying? I'm kind of like going a little bit deeper on these things, that I think that there has to be like independent symmetry breakers from other considerations, which is why I've never like gone super deep down the AI path, because for me, I don't know if that would decide it one way or another. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. It's like, I mean, I get the point, but then at some point, I know what I'm putting into a computer, right? It's everything. I have control on each and every element that's going there, like from the first connection, the resistor, the program. I know everything basically. It's everything. And so if there's more than that, because I'm not putting conscious, like if consciousness arises from a complexity, then how can you tell it's something completely different? Like when I think about this, for example, I think in physical terms, in a way that you have quantum mechanics that was on a very microscopic level, but then when you smooth out things and you look things from larger scales, then you sort of lose this, you have different rules governing the world, because the rules that govern the single electron are not the same rules that govern like 1 billion of electrons together.
Right.
Like if you have to take 1 billion of electrons together, then you wouldn't apply the same kind of equations. It wouldn't work. Right. You lose something and you gain something else. Yeah. So I wonder if the same kind of things, as like complexity arising from small processes, which I do control, and then at some point there is some phase transition, as you said, or is it something completely different that's coming out?
Yeah, I'll just say one quick remark to that. I think that's where a lot of these kind of identity experiments and these other thought experiments or these other arguments like phaser will bear in on those considerations. At least they do for me, right? Because I have nothing against emergence, right? If that's what we're talking about. But I'll take a kind of another thought experiment from my friend Josh Rasmussen, right? If I see water emerging from the rock, right? Okay, cool. Water is emerging from a rock. And maybe the rock is all I know, and the rock was the only kind of input there, right, that I put there, or the only one aware of. But given what I also know, like I'm pretty damn sure the rock isn't the entire story, right? Like there's something else here that is explained, because like the rock isn't the type of thing, right, that causes water to emerge. So like, Jim, I know we were going to talk about emergence on another podcast at some point. Maybe this is a good way to kind of move into it, but I don't have, again, an issue with emergence theories. It's more of the kind of deeper considerations that the deeper metaphysical considerations of how you're like, if you look at it as an Aristotelian, cool. Like I'm actually quite attracted to a lot of elements of emergentism, right? I actually think like an Aristotelian metaphysical perspective actually makes better sense of something like that than a physicalism does for some of the considerations that we've been talking about. So I think a lot of these conversations, and again, philosophy of mind is just something I peek into. It's not something I'm specialized in like Jim. I think a lot of them are just kind of like too far down the road in a number of respects that we got to kind of back the conversation up. There was one other thing. Oh, Rasmussen's got a cool thing too. He actually has an article on, he calls it the counting argument against reductive materialism. You'll like that, Edoardo, because he uses Cantor's theorem to show that there's more mental properties than physical properties, right? So like you can't reduce it. You can't reduce it. And that I found that a really interesting argument, more complex than we would want to go into in this conversation, but I'll dig it up and I'll link it in the show notes as well. So yeah, I just want to throw that out there, but Jim, I know you wanted to say something else too.
Yeah. Can I make one more quick point about AI and then maybe come back to emergence? Is that all right? So, I don't doubt that you could get machines that would even, pass Turing tests with respect to our emotional lives, or, that would say the right things about concern and such, right? But I think what's distinctive about us, because we're living things, and we're living things that are aware that we are living things for only a finite time, is ultimately all of our concerns are grounded in our relationship to death. Okay. And it seems to me in that makes human consciousness something that is inherently wrapped up with our status as finite biological beings. Do you see that? And so that to me is ultimately the difference between us and machines, is that we are consciously aware that we're subject to death, right? And I think that's it's that temporal backdrop in that existential sense that gives human consciousness a distinctive flavor, right? But I don't know how I could, like, once again, you could get a machine that would pass a Turing test to say the right things about death, right? But the question is if it's not a living organism, is it really concerned about death, right? And that's where I kind of would say I find it hard to believe a non-living thing would actually have experience of its impending death in a way that gives its life a sort of meaning that we have in light of our impending death, right? So Edoardo, if you'd like to respond to that before I go to the point about emergence, feel free, or if not, it's your call.
Because of course, like this, it's something I'm thinking of. How much is our consciousness about death? Mm-hmm. Due to the fact that we see death around us? I mean, at some point we know that we have, mm-hmm. relatives that are gone missing, or, mm-hmm. we see like actual people dying. Mm-hmm. It used to be like the case was pretty a common thing back then, like when our pre-ancestors. And it's something that we are constantly exposed to.
I think our lack of this is why we freaked out about COVID the way we did, right?
Oh yeah, probably yes. Right. Sure. Yeah. Let's not talk about this, because that would be a much broader issue.
We could go on about that. Yeah.
Next time, I mean, it's a topic that we already discussed with Pat in a couple of occasions.
But we don't need to get down that rabbit hole. Uh-huh.
My exactly. My question is, so how much is this grounded in biology, which surely is to some extent? How much is this grounded in experience? Like if you would take a child and just, let's assume it grows in an isolated island without any contact with any other human being, mm-hmm. like would it develop like a consciousness about dying?
No,
and to what extent would it be?
Not a human consciousness. It wouldn't. It would be cognitively very stunted, right?
That's. Right. I mean, that's one thing. So, because I can always envision some kind of machine that learns about death in the way that we learn. Yeah. In that way, again, then would the machine be conscious that at some point it would be thrown in the dustbin? I don't know. Again,
I don't know. See, I think at this point we've gone inscrutable. right? Do you see
Yeah.
that? You know,
Yeah.
and that's why I would say
If I
I'm
can make
not
comments
driving
about
the thesis. Yeah.
Then just about one of the comments before
Mhm.
that I thought was pretty interesting. But it's a Horseman 3222. But if a machine would be built by people who are modeled by evolution and culture, wouldn't machine be extension of that? Not necessarily. I mean, maybe. I mean, it. Of course, it reflects our prejudice on the world. Like the way we model AI, it's inspired by nature in a way. It's like the way the AI learns, the way we model neural networks, they are inspired by actual neurons work. Like
Right.
in theory, that's in a very general, broad and general way.
Especially
That's
if you
one
get like
thing.
neural net modeling, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's like
yeah.
you call it. Of course, there's. Then if you go into the details, there's there's some wide resemblance to the actual nature. It's not. I mean, it's not even close to the real thing. Of course, it's just just the idea that you can get some inputs and then the neurons adjust the connections and then they have some weights and you have some kind of memory that you can plug into there and that's the way things are developed. Of course, that's a very simplistic thing and a very simplistic approach. But then I think that there's something that comes out of these machines. I mean, the way, again, if you think about neural networks, that can produce unexpected outcomes. Because the prejudice and the bias that we have that comes from our understanding of nature comes in the design of this machine. But then there's a lot of parameters and things that get adjusted in a way that is not really interpretable by human. And that makes things complicated. So you can get really unexpected results. Or you can get some kind of, as I said, like something that resembles irony or sarcasm from a neural network. And I mean, it's not clear why. It's something that it's unexpected. It could lead to some kind of unforeseen. But I mean, something that it's not there. It's not. Again, there's some kind of emerging complexity in a way. So even though it's designed by a man, it could lead to something that men didn't think of before.
Right. No, I agree. Just in the same way that like evolution gave rise to human intelligence, and human intelligence has pushed back against that in many, many ways. Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, that's the human drama. Right. So, going to the emergence business.
Well, let me just make one
go
quick note for people in the chat. I'm dropping in links to some of the resources we've mentioned along the way. So just if anybody's interested in reading any of the papers we've discussed, that's what's happening there. So Jim, continue.
Yeah. And just my favorite, because I want to give credit where credit's due. A lot of what I'm saying about AI is derivative from a recently late philosopher and cognitive science named John Hoagland, who famously said, the problem with computers is they just don't give a damn, right? Which I love that line. But anyway, so yeah, I'm ultimately defending a kind of emergence view. Okay, and I think it's clear we do get more out of complex systems than goes into them in many cases in nature. Okay, the case I'm making though is the complexity from which something like a thought arises is not the complexity within a nervous system is not sufficient for that, right? And in fact, even thinking internal to the organism, we have to go outside the nervous system to make sense of all of cognition, right? We know now, like the gut biome has a lot to do with what's going on cognitively and things like that too. But the point I'm making is, for instance, my thought about Paris would not have the same content it has today if Charles Martel had not won a battle at Tours, right? Some hundreds of years ago, right? And so the point I'm trying to make here is the complexity on which thought emerges is the complexity of an entire history of the world, okay? And entire histories of the world are not the sorts of things that we can, at least at this point in human development, include in a discrete scientific theory. And that's why I think thought will always be sort of what, famously it's been said, a nomenological dangler. It will fall outside of complete scientific explanation just because to have thought is to be embedded in this entire world with a history, right? Which is not something we can give a discrete account of. Because at the very least, the history could have gone a different way, and there's not a law-like explanation of why it went the way it did, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but I can still envision a world where, I can make a completely fictitious history about something and train a machine with that fictitious history, and then, get a very complicated robot and ask questions, and it would answer like the way you do about any invented war or so, and
Sure. Yeah. I don't necessarily.
It would affect the way, if I were told, I don't know, like in North Korea, right, that your leaders are grown out of gods and whatever the god sent them on Earth, and you grew up believing that, and then it affects your thought and your worldview and everything, and the way you feel things.
But a few things I would say about that. One is, I mean, this invites like an age-old thought experiment. I don't think it's decisive, but it is interesting in as much like, imagine the alien that comes down and like doesn't know if the human being is actually conscious. They're lying on a table, right? And they can map scientifically, neuroscientifically, you name it. Edoardo's gone.
Was our man.
We'll wait till he comes back till I finish the thought, because I don't want to miss that. This is good stuff.
Are there looming questions in the peanut gallery?
Yeah, we'll pull up the questions here in just a second. Okay,
sorry.
Yeah. So it's like, even if they could know all the physical details about us, like, and this is the problem of other minds that Edoardo was talking about, right? Is like they wouldn't know what we're thinking about, right? Unless we already have data that has been revealed to us by people who tell us what they're thinking about, right? You're not going to get that from just the kind of the third person perspective from that, right? It always presupposes that somebody with that first person perspective has been telling us something, right? And then you can map correlations, which is a lot of what neuroscience does. And I think that's where, to your point, Jim, like I'm totally cool with the point and open to point that we might get huge, very accurate predictive success between those correlations. But it always presupposes something deeper that I think is overlooked. But it's not insignificant, right? Those presuppositions. I think oftentimes they are the most significant considerations. There was one other thing I wanted to bring up, but it popped out of my mind right now. So I don't know, Jim, why don't you keep going on with your, well, you know what? There is empirical evidence, Jim. I don't know if Jim's going to get pissed if I bring up near-death experiences again, but I mean, there is like, that's at the end of the day, like we run these thought experiments. So like, what do we have on the scene? And something that's deeply fascinated me are the peer-reviewed journal articles in places like the Lancet of near-death experiences that really strain, again, like these data points fit better with certain philosophies of mind, say that, than others, right? And they don't fit well with physicalist philosophies of mind, because you have, what are some of these data points for people who aren't familiar with these studies, right? You have people clinically dead, does like little to no brain activity in many cases.
According to our current means of measuring.
Right, yeah, according to our best means of measurement, like fixed and dilated pupils, flat EEG, stuff like that. And they have not only like rich sensorial experiences, but this is the key, they report veridical data that's later affirmed by independent researchers. So, the one hypothesis is, this is just due to oxygen deprivation. It's a hallucination. But the problem with that is hallucinations don't produce veridical experiences that get later confirmation, especially of like things that this person presumably could no way have access to. Like they can tell you about a shoe that's on the top of the hospital building because they somehow got up there in this near-death experience. And then the investigators verify that, right? And you've got tons of well-confirmed stuff like this. Again, not in like the new age clearance bin at Barnes & Noble, but in top-rate journals of stuff like that. So there's also one really interesting stuff on near-death experience of people who were congenitally blind seeing in these. So they have sensorial, visual experiences, congenitally blind, and veridical. Now, if so all these other considerations, imaginations, thought experience, that's all well and good. I think that can provide motivation, but there's also other data out there that strains certain hypotheses. It doesn't say it refutes it. It strains it. It hurts it. Has not found adequate explanation by it. Maybe it will at some point, but fits well or fits better with other hypotheses. So I think, like, if we're just looking at, as Edoardo said at the beginning of the conversation, like, what's the world actually like? What's all the data we have to accommodate? I think that is something that we have to seriously throw in there, right?
Okay, if you want to start weighing, okay, you want to say, yeah, you've got some empirical stuff that would like support a dualist hypothesis, like say near-death experiences. Well, how much empirical stuff do you have that supports the opposite? Okay, like brain damage deeply affecting consciousness. Do you know what I mean? So,
right,
I mean, you have
to
to look at like the total weight, right? You've got some few cases here,
right,
versus a really massive weight in the other direction.
Yeah, but I see the way my philosophy of mind, you know me, Jim, like it's like it makes sense of both of those, right? Like it's no surprise to me as somebody who takes a generally, hylomorphic view of things that if you knock somebody over the head with a baseball bat, most of the time they're going black, right? Right. Or you might severely impair their cognitive capacity.
Pretty hard to make sense. And I'm not saying it's impossible because I've tried to, right? Okay. But it's pretty hard to make sense of disembodied consciousness on a hylomorphic view too, right? And it's really my hylomorphism that kind of leads me to like not want to go for the near death.
Right. And look, when I talk to other Aristotelians, they tend to not be as sympathetic. But and look, I'm very Aristotelian, but that is a data that strains it.
Yeah. I agree.
The data that strains it that I have to try and accommodate.
But I think you're overestimating the weight of that data compared to like all these other things that would. You see me? If you want to make an argument in the philosophy of mind based on empirical stuff, right?
Yeah, no, I would just say that
you're going to have to look at like how many cases of near-death experience do we have to how many other cases do we have that seem to support some kind of like material stasis,
or is there a hylomorphic model that can support both well? And I think maybe something like a trialist interactionist model could, right? Now that's getting us way down in the weeds, but it's because of both of those data that you're talking about, which I fully appreciate, that has forced me to try.
I think when
you need to accommodate for.
I think when you've gone trialist, you're not a hylomorphist anymore. Right?
And maybe I'm not. Maybe I've moved beyond. Maybe that could be true. But in the spirit of following the world, right, of the data, that's kind of where I've been led. But I think
in science though, we don't like you admit that there are anomalies, right? Unaccounted for anomalies for any theory, right? And the question is like where the preponderance directs you,
right?
And like you always like write a promissory note of those anomalies, right?
Which would be the case if there were like 10 of these things out there, I'd easily swipe them away. But it's way more than that, right?
I'm not sure. I mean, it really depends on the level. I mean, you have anomalies, but if you have anomalies on something that you expect to be like a fundamental theory, then it's a massive blow. Right. If it's some kind of model. There's different levels of theorizing in science. So, like for Newton's theory, which was supposed like to be extremely, how would you say, like fundamental, when you started with the observations that were in direct contrast with Newton's prediction, like for the perihelion of Mercury or the deflection of the light from the stars. Those things that it couldn't be accommodated within that framework. There were just 2 observations by the end of the 20s of the last century, maybe 3. I don't know. It's not many, and it was a very successful theory. But still, we had to throw it away. It's like, okay, this is not the correct theory. It's like a good model, and then it's sort of it depends. Like if you have a very fundamental theory now about the mind and the way it interacts with the physical world,
those were repeatable.
You really need to accommodate for all. Sorry.
Those were repeatable experimental observations, right?
Some of them are like those about the universe, for example, not so much because there's we got one universe, and then like for example, deflection of the light of the rays of light from a star. You really need to be lucky in a way that you find that star that there was this eclipses, solar eclipses from eclipse on. That allowed to see this. It was like one in a lifetime event with that star and the sun in that position, so to say. Mm-hmm. Then you could repeat with different stars, different things. So it's not exactly. I mean, like the theory is the same. You can repeat like the structure of the theory. You can test it in different ways, but it's not exactly the same experiment. It's you cannot really replicate that. Even if you look at the universe at large, you could argue that CMB, like the cosmic microwave background, is a strong point in favor of I don't know, like the standard cosmological model, or the Big Bang theory, so to say. but it's not. You cannot really replicate it. We just got one universe. We only get one of those observations.
Anybody who followed the right procedure could observe that background radiation, right?
Yes, I mean the other thing is what you make out of it,
right?
Because of course, like from one observation, then you need some kind of modeling to translate that observation. Because at the end of the day, what you see is just radiation, right? So you need to have a theory of how radiation works, how it interacts with the atmosphere, how does it propagate in vacuum, how does it propagate from distant stars. There's all sorts of phenomena that you need to have some kind of modeling.
Yeah.
And so...
this is kind of my point about the near-death experiences is something like observing the background radiation in the universe, even though we only have one universe, right? My understanding is like anyone who has access to the right equipment and can understand what they're doing could replicate that experiment, right? It doesn't presuppose that like all the entanglements of human memory and suggestion and stuff like that can go into this, right? That's why for me the only relevant cases in near-death experiences are the ones that involve veridical stuff, right?
Oh, I agree with that. Yeah.
Okay, you know what I mean. And then, do you see my point there, right? But even that isn't. If you want to say we're making a scientific argument here, it's not something we can replicate, right? So I'm not quite sure what to do with that. If what we're saying we're doing here is making a scientific argument, right?
Yeah, mine would be it's a C inductive argument. Call it that, right?
Yeah.
And I'm happy with that, right? It increases the probability of some other hypothesis. And
I'll give you that. It increases the hypothesis of dualism. I just don't think it tips it, right?
No, yeah, no, I don't. And like I said, I don't think it should be decisive by any means. But I would. The other thing I want to say about it, actually, my question for you, Jim, is this, right? Because I've said this before. I'm kind of agnostic on philosophy of mind in terms of like what my position is. Like I'm more confident in what theories I think are almost certainly false, right? Yeah. And I kind of like flirt with like a Lonergarian trialist interactionist, broadly is kind of what I think to my mind seems to make sense of all the things I need to make sense of. But then talking to you of like the mind as participation in the world has shifted my thinking in important ways as well. So like I'm deeply in development of how I'm thinking about all this. So, I'd be curious,
so am I.
And you know it for a long time. It's tough stuff. I know we called this an introduction episode. It was kind of anything but, right? But this is fun. I'm sorry. I have to go to dinner here in like 5 or so minutes, and I hate to interrupt this fascinating conversation. Yeah. So I don't know if you guys just had any. We could definitely do a part 2. This has been a blast. But
Edoardo, maybe it's just a teaser, but I want to talk to you about aliens. Okay.
All right.
And maybe we don't have time now because one of the things I want to go ahead and start looking at is the philosophy of mind and the cognitive science of alien intelligence. Right.
All right.
Because maybe I shouldn't even open the can, but I worry about whether or not an organism with whom we have no evolutionary background in common is something we could expect to recognize as intelligent, right? So I have a pet chameleon, okay, and I can recognize Bob the chameleon as intelligent in a way because he hunts crickets and I eat too, right? And he wants to look good for the lady chameleons and I want to look good for the lady. Okay. So so I can understand Bob and I can say, yeah, what he's doing is smart. Okay. But it's harder for me to do that for a jellyfish, right? Because I have so much less in common, right? But there's a perfectly good sense in which a jellyfish is just as smart as Bob, right? Okay. Well, then what happens if we're dealing with beings with whom we have nothing in common, right? And in terms of a common ancestry, right?
Yeah.
And why would we think that evolution had to go the way that it went here, right? Where, like the same pressures of natural selection were incumbent on organisms in an entirely different planetary situation, right? Or we assume a certain kind of game theory, that organisms would act more or less self-interestedly and stuff like that. But it seems to me when you open up this kettle of fish, you could have an entirely different game theory that's operating.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, so for me, I'm sort of like, well, damn, for all we know, they're here in the room right now. And we just can't recognize them. Once we admit like something like the Drake equations, where we say, yeah, there's probably smart stuff out there. But then we understand how tied our ability to recognize it is to the history we occupy. Now it seems to me like the question got very interesting as to whether we could recognize them or, whether they're in the room right now, right?
I mean, the thing that they're in the room right now, you could see as,
I'm not that crazy, but
no. But it could be in the sense that you have this whole dark matter and dark energy stuff that's supposed to make like 90% of the universe. It's supposed to be like the largest components in energy-wise and matter-wise in the universe. And so I don't see why, if you have some kind of complicated structures arising in something which is, again, as far as we can tell, it's like 5% of the total energy content of the universe. Why wouldn't you have some kind of complex structure, like with conscience and rationality? And again, you have some kind of pressure, like evolutionary pressure in this dark matter world, which is something we cannot see and we cannot interact with, because you can see the gravitational effects of it, but on small scales like the Earth, it would be undetectable in a way. I mean, it would be largely undetectable. If you had like an alien, a single spaceship or a single, but it would be undetectable. And then that's also another thing. I mean, it's again, if you just don't think about the matter that we are aware of in the universe, then you could have a whole source of possibility on the other.
Right.
So I think it totally makes sense. I mean, it's like we had to face some kind of pressures, like some kind of obstacles on Earth that drew, that sort of led the way for evolution in a way. That they paved. That you could sort of tell, like from this kind of setting, you would end up with some kind of equilibrium somewhere.
Yeah.
And even that is not like it's not. You shouldn't take it for granted. But just imagine somewhere else, like with some kind of totally different time scales and chemical materials and who knows what. So
who knows what? Yeah. So
that's a very interesting question.
And so I think
I know close to nothing, but
yeah, and I think a lot of times if you look at the way we think of detecting alien intelligence, it's like we're kind of applying a Turing test, right?
Yeah.
Like we're looking for something that would talk back to us in our language, right? But why would we think it would be anything like our language, right?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is that I don't know if I'm sure you know about the SETI project. It was, I think, it was at the end of the 90s, and then it went on for more than a couple of years.
Right.
But the whole idea was just to look for electromagnetic signals that were not within whatever you would expect to be produced naturally. So you just look for some kind of pattern that no known source would produce. Like you have some kind of radio signal that has some very, very weird features, and there's no way you can accommodate for it in nature. As far as we know, again, everything could just be something natural, but seeing some kind of very weird pattern could be like a data point, as Pat says, like in that direction. And that was the whole idea. Like, there again, you are assuming that intelligent creatures sort of manipulate the electromagnetic spectrum. I mean, I think it's
certainly something that manipulates the electromagnetic spectrum is an intelligent creature, right? So it's probably a sufficient condition, right? So I think we're disposed to pick up other intelligent life that's like us, right? But it seems to me that when you start talking infinite universe and probably, billions of planets that might have life on them, whether we would expect what got to us would be at all like us, it becomes a question.
Right. Or
because
something
they interact with they also interact with the electromagnetic spectrum, right? If they are made out of the same matter that we are made, then at some point they will face as far as we know, because we can look at very far away stars, and so we can look at the chemical properties, and we know that
some constraints. Yeah,
they have the same photons. I mean, they would be interacting with the same photons that we are interacting with, as
Yeah.
far as we can tell, because we can look at the lights coming from very far away stars.
Yeah.
And so if they are intelligent enough to recognize that this thing, that of course there's no way they don't interact with it. I mean, the only way
Yeah.
to grow up some kind of intelligent, whatever life, is by interaction with light, with electromagnetic So if then you grow intelligent enough, then you have to get to the point that you recognize that you have this source of radiation that is, again, you have to cross the threshold, so you could still be intelligent, but not enough. Like it'd be like humans in the Middle Ages.
And so I wonder though how much of this assumes they're motivated the same way we are.
Oh,
right. And so that's where the game theory piece comes in. Like, we always assume, well, if they're intelligent and they're leaving aside the dark matter universe, I think that's a real problem. Okay. They're in that 5% that we're in, right?
All right.
And so they're manipulating electromagnetic fields similar to like what we would. Okay, so we can see that they would be physically detectable, but then we assume because, hey, we eventually would run out of space on our planet because we're like these greedy apes, right? And so then we would want to start exploring other parts of the universe for resources, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, couldn't evolution have gone down a pathway where you would have highly successful, intelligent beings that were not greedy apes and therefore have a completely different game theory in terms of what's predictable and rational for their practical endeavors, right? And I wonder if we could recognize them, right, as one of us if they're operating by a completely different practical game theory.
Why don't we leave that as a question mark
for the next time? Yes.
I would love to deep dive this with you.
Yeah. This has been an absolute blast, gentlemen.
Fun,
Super appreciate it. I know we said like introduction, but we kind of just like went. But that's what I like. Those are my favorite kinds of conversations.
It might have been this party only the three of us were invited to, but that's cool.
That's cool. That's the kind of party I'm into. So good stuff. Yeah, I'm off to the local brew pub. So
right.
Yeah. So for people who are tuning in. Edoardo, we're almost to like, what is this, our fourth stream?
I think so, yeah.
So I think the statistics are if you get past like your 7th podcast, you have a higher likelihood that you'll actually make it a consistent thing. So
we'll make it.
Yeah, so we're going to do it. We're going to get at least another 7.
We're going to do it.
Yeah, so people, please, please like, subscribe. This is a blast. So we'll coordinate behind the scenes and do a part 2, guys. Any final thoughts from you guys?
It was an honor, man. Thank you. I learned a lot.